And so how would you answer someone who brings up the objection and says, belief in God's not reasonable? So they say, our modern world, we have science, we've looked at the world, nothing has turned up that there's a God, it just doesn't make sense.
I would want to say two things. First of all, or several things, more than two things. And that's where there's a sense of the presuppositionalism needs to come in. So how do we know the world around us? And if we're having a discussion with a person who is persuaded that we can only know those things which we can see, taste, touch, and feel. And since I can't see, taste, touch, and feel God, then therefore he can't exist.
Right. Which is the naturalism.
Which is the naturalistic sort of worldview. And what I'd want to push back on is more fundamentally the idea of naturalism. And so, and show why it's kind of an insufficient view of reality. And so that's where our apologetic would want to do two things. We'd want to kind of stand in their shoes and say, if naturalism's true, it cuts out a lot of things that we can't know. It destroys value. It does destroy justice because we can't see, taste, touch, and feel justice. It does destroy love. It does destroy even logic. We can't see, taste, touch, and feel logic. Right. And so it would end up, so what we'd want to show is that naturalism is somewhat of a self-refuting philosophy, and it kind of begs the question. It can't demonstrate that the only things we can know is see, taste, touch, and feel. It just wants to assume that, and that's where we as Christians need to understand the nature of arguments, because if we allow them to dictate the discussion and that, they frame the debate, that because even if you and I were standing there and we observed Jesus be crucified, we observed him do miracles, we observed him do a bunch of things, we can never move from those observations to therefore he's the eternal God. There's no sense impression that anybody can ever give us that would say, oh yeah, this being's eternal, because we're not eternal, so we'll never have this universal sense perception of those things. So what we want to do, so kind of the idea of God being reasonable and logical, and that's what we'd want to tie in. So kind of twofold is go after the idea of what is reason and logic, and I think that's a very important thing, because we usually beg the question of what we mean by logic or what's reasonable. So for the average scientist, they believe it's reasonable to go from the observations we made from the past to therefore the future's going to be like the past. And then, so that's one form, it's called induction, and that's one form of logic that we all use. We all, when you're a little kid, only once do you need to learn you don't hang around with bees. You know what I mean? The bee stings you, you're kind of like, all right, I'm staying away from bees. And that's an inductive experience. There's nothing logically that would necessitate every bee can sting you and you might have an allergic reaction, whatever it's going to be. We learn that through induction. So we take these specific instances and then we generalize from those specifics. But in that form of logic, there's actually no necessity. So try to make it maybe a little more simple. If you and I have only observed black swans, there's no necessity that all swans are black. The next one we see could be white. And so does that make sense with the necessity thing? And so whereas another form of logic is deductive logic, and the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. So for example, the most common one would be all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal. If the first premise is true, all men are mortal. And if Socrates really is a man, it's necessarily true. And can you see the difference between all swans I've seen are black, I don't know what the premises would be, all swans I've seen are black, then the necessity of following, therefore all swans are black. It doesn't follow from the premise that every observation you've made about a swan, it's going to follow that by necessity. So there you have two forms of logic that people are talking about. The average person who's asking about whether or not belief in God is reasonable is usually operating from a form of induction, which means, and so they want to draw from particular observations to general conclusions. Yeah. So I kind of want to concede, if that's your definition of logic, I admit I can't prove to you God's existence. I can't prove to you the Christian God. But what I would seek to do is kind of show why the very nature of doing induction and the uniformity of nature is that tomorrow is going to be like today. And so when you set your alarm at night and you expect the sun to rise, it's because you believe in the uniformity of nature. And what I would seek to do as a Christian is showing why that's rooted not in a world that's evolving, not in a world that is kind of arbitrary, but it's rooted in a world that God has made and God governs, and there's providence behind the universe. That's why we can look to the uniformity of nature, because we have a personal being governing the universe. It's not anarchy. You know what I mean? The universe, and that's why we talk about the laws, because we don't think the world's anarchy. So I would seek to show that inductive logic is actually rooted in the Christian God. And then also deductively, for us to know a universal, all men are mortal, type of thing is actually rooted in a form of revelation. For us to make a universal claim, I can't know all things. And so for me to say all men are mortal, I've never experienced all men. So that's a more of a philosophical claim. So try to tie that up is with the idea of logic, I would seek to show that that our use of logic, be it induction or deduction, is actually rooted in a reasonable being, a mind that backs the universe. And so logic, be it induction or deduction, is rooted in minds, not material things. And so what I would want to say is backing the universe is a mind, as a personal being. And that's why John 1:1 identifies Jesus as the logos of God, or the logic of God. It's often interpreted the word, but I would say logos is probably a better understanding, that you have this, the Greeks had this idea that there's a mind governing the universe, and so the word's a little maybe not always the best translation, but it's what we come to know it as. But I would say Jesus is a logos. And so when we go to pursue something logical, or where it's rooted in the logos, which I would ultimately point towards Jesus opposed to the material universe.